Ladies and gentlemen, once again, it's James Williams, also known as Dark Waters, to the entire paranormal world, and I'm back to talk about Mothman. Now, you guys know I've had a couple of Mothman stories come out of Chicago, and when I originally heard those stories, I was like, this can't be true. This is absolutely insane. It's crazy. But now I have someone on with me who I won't use the word expert because people go crazy when you use the word expert. But I would say somebody who's definitely proficient in what it takes to talk about Mothman, and that is Mr. Steve Ward. Steve, welcome to the Dark Waters channel. Welcome to Dark Waters Radio and the Dark Waters Network. How are you today, my brother?
I am beyond wonderful. Thank you for having me on.
I'm happy to have you here with us, man. And as we get started, let me go back and start with this first question. This is just like my go-to question. When did you first fall in love with things paranormal? When did it start for you?
Well, I guess as a kid, I was always fascinated by science fiction, and would go to the matinees every Saturday to see a great B movie like Earth versus the Flying Saucers or whatever, or the latest radiation mutation trying to destroy the world, and I'd heard about UFOs, flying saucers, and I guess really the first spark was a friend of mine, Bill, who lived down the street. I came over to his house one day and he said he saw this great program on TV the night before. I didn't even see it. There was an old TV show called You Asked for It. And what people would do is they'd write in and they would ask to see for them to cover certain things. So apparently they talked about flying saucers this one night. And I think what they talked about was there are a couple of old films, one over Utah in the 50s, and there's another one. And when you see these 16 millimeter films, you just see these like white dots in loose formation going across the sky. And the skeptics said, well, they're just birds, the sun reflecting off birds and so forth. But at any rate, just the idea that these things might actually be real just fired my imagination. And as time went on, I was introduced to the books of Frank Edwards. Frank Edwards was a newscaster. He's probably best known for, he wrote a book called Flying Saucers, Serious Business during a big wave of UFO sightings. But he had these great anthologies, Strange World, Strangest of All. That's where I first read about the Flatwoods Monster in West Virginia. What else? Oh, the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins. Even the first time I read about Sasquatch, I think he had a chapter in one of his books that was called something like The Monster Apes of Oregon. So that was kind of my early introduction. But then 1966 was the big year. March of 1966 in Michigan, where I was growing up in the Detroit area. We had a wave of UFO sightings, a huge flap. It was also throughout the Midwest. And a lot of very credible people were seeing these things. And our then Senator, Gerald Ford, got pretty angry at the Air Force because they were just ignoring it. And he knew that a lot of his constituents, who were very credible, were actually seeing these things. So now, you know the name Dr. J. Allen Hynek.
Yes.
He was attached to Project Blue Book at this point. So he still had his, apron strings kind of connected to the Air Force, even though for some time he had begun to realize, even though he started out as a skeptic, that there was really something to this. So he actually asked the Air Force, well, look, there's a lot of stuff going on in Michigan. Do you want me to go down there and check it out? They said, no, don't worry about it. Nobody has called us about it. And the next day, they got a call from Senator Gerald Ford, very angry that they hadn't done anything. Next day, Hynek is on a plane. So he's there and doing some investigation. And then, a twist of fate. He's giving this press conference. And I remember seeing it as a kid. I was in junior high at the time. So I was in junior high, so I couldn't drive. I couldn't play UFO investigator. I could just watch the news.
You could just watch the news, huh?
You can't have your mom drive you to a UFO investigation site. It just doesn't, you kind of lose your credibility. So he was giving a press conference. The Air Force kind of wanted him to defuse things. So he suggested that some of the sightings in Hillsdale, Michigan, they were at Hillsdale, Ann Arbor, Dexter, that area, a bit west of where I lived in Detroit. He said some of them might be swamp gas. Well, that's all the press needed. UFOs are marsh gas, end of story. Now, that the cool thing is that 10 years later, after Dr. Hynek took off the black hat and was wearing a white hat, he had separated from the Air Force. He had started the Center for UFO Studies in Edmondson, Illinois. He was an astronomer, by the way, at Northwestern University. And he spoke at the MUFON Symposium in I think it was June or July of 10 years later. And it was great because the name of his talk was Swamp Gas Plus 10 and Counting. And it was a serious talk, but there was a lot of humor in it. Him talking about the days of years bygone years where he made a few mistakes and so forth. So it was quite funny. But then after that flap in March of 1966, a few months later, mid-November, this winged humanoid with red glowing eyes chased two couples down Route 62 north of the Point Pleasant area, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which is just right on the Ohio River. And that was pretty amazing. So I was kind of following the Mothman story even before he was even dubbed Mothman. Back then, they were just calling him the Bird or Big Bird. The Batman TV show was popular at the time, so some very creative copy editor dubbed him Mothman, even though it didn't look anything like a moth. But that's really what got me started. And
Wow. So that's where the name Mothman comes from. I didn't know that.
it was just a play on Batman. That's all, because
Wow.
the actual there are many very stylized representations of Mothman, including the majestic Mothman statue in the heart of Point Pleasant, and not too many of them. This, if you can see this here, this is a little bit closer to what the image on my T-shirt than some of them saw, I guess. But you'll find some very, very creative and stylized representations of Mothman. But so that's kind of what got me started. We had a high school UFO club. We even produced a sort of an amateur UFO publication, and the rest is history, I guess.
Man, that's awesome. So you've been in this for a long time. So this really is a love and a passion of yours. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna approach this because I don't know much about Mothman, and the only way I learn is by talking to people who know more than me. So when I start asking you these questions, please, it's okay. I'm gonna come across real ignorant to the subject, and I'm fine with being that way. I want to know and I want to learn. So when you start talking about the very first sighting, you have this couple that's chased by this being with red eyes. They described it more similar to what's on the T-shirt that you're wearing, right?
Yes. Um, there were actually a couple sightings just prior to that, but this was the big one. This one hit the wire services. It went all over the world. It was the Linda and Roger Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Mallet. They were two married couples, and they were driving around what they call the TNT area. TNT area is north, about 9 miles north of Point Pleasant. Now, if you look at the old photographs during World War II, this was an area where they created munitions and dynamite and so forth for the war effort. And they stored these explosives in 100 of these concrete bunkers. They look like concrete igloos, which are still out there today. And it was quite a complex back in those days. But by the time the mid 60s rolled around, there were only a few buildings, a few structures left. And today it's the McClintock Wildlife Area. It's just very overgrown, but very eerie and very creepy. But they were out there driving around, and they drove by they were coming down a road by the Old North Power Plant. The power plant was just a ruin, and it was dark. And Linda said, what's that man doing standing in the middle of the road? And then that man sprouted wings on either side, and it shuffled along a little bit and went off toward the North Power Plant. They also saw that it had red glowing eyes, and it didn't seem to be eye shine. When you talk to a lot of these witnesses, it seemed more like it was generating its own light, as you do hear about some of these different cryptid reports. Even some Bigfoot reports have that kind of phenomenon.
Yes, they do.
So they took off. They hit the gas, and they went in toward Point Pleasant, south on Route 62. This thing followed them. and it never got in front of them, but they could tell sometimes it was above the car and sometimes it wasn't. They actually they stopped at a place called Tiny's Drive-In at first, and Linda worked there, and she talked to her boss. He said, you should go to the police. So they went to the police, and the police separated all of them, and they wrote out their experiences. You can get Jeff Wamsley, who is the curator of the Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant. Jeff was about 5 or 6 years old when all this happened. You had it was like a 13-month period from the sighting that the two couples had to the end of the 13th month where the Silver Bridge collapsed. And we can talk about that later. But and Jeff has accumulated all this information, the history, the folklore. He even has a wall filled with the memorabilia from the film, The Mothman Prophecies, which is very cool. So, but he's got all these copies of these handwritten statements that they gave. And they separated them, and they essentially gave the same story. And this, like I say, this hit the wire services. And Mary Heyer, who was a local reporter there and became a good friend and colleague of John Keel, who eventually, almost 10 years later, wrote the Mothman Prophecies. She told John that she'd heard these men recount their story several times, and they never changed it. They never embellished it. Nowadays, some of the Linda Scarberry, I got a chance to speak to her before she died. She died a few years ago, but many of the other principal witnesses have just become very quiet.
So let's circle back and go into the prophecies in the bridge. This is what I know about it so far, and this is all from documentaries because a lot of my knowledge comes from firsthand talking out of people like you or witnesses. I watched a couple of documentaries where the Mothman landed on the bridge, and I think it was days before, then the day after, a couple of days after, the bridge collapsed. I haven't been able to mentally tie that in because they're saying he's a harbinger of bad events to come. And how did that reputation come? It was because it could have been absolute coincidence that he landed on that bridge. How did they make that leap?
Actually, I'm not sure that they ever actually saw him on the bridge. Some of those reports are pretty
What?
dubious. Yeah, I know.
Come on.
However, a lot of people saw him all that entire year leading up to the bridge collapse. Many people do think he's a harbinger. Others say no, it just happened at the same time period. Some people believe that whatever this thing was actually caused the bridge collapse. Uh, I'm one that think that it's one of those things that happened, in time and space. So it's always connected with the Mothman. But and there were even some claims that somebody saw a UFO before it collapsed. There was a flash of light. John Keel thought the flash of light was very likely the power cable snapping when the bridge went down. So I really don't think that Mothman was seen on the bridge. But it was interesting. John Keel got a bizarre report. This kind of ties in, I guess, with the Men in Black lore. And again, it may not mean anything. Some woman contacted Mary Heyer, the reporter, and said that she saw two men climbing on the bridge. They were kind of in street shoes. It didn't make any sense why they were just like a couple days before it collapsed. And they were wearing checkered shirts. Well, this checkered shirt motif shows up a lot in paranormal apparitions and experiences.
Right.
And again, this may not, you got to have to be very careful because sometimes things that seem like they might be connected, seem like they might be mysterious, really aren't. But I think, unfortunately, I don't think Mothman ever actually showed up on the bridge.
Well, let's touch on that checkered shirt because just recently, I think maybe 6 months ago, this wave of flannel shirt man encounters hit the paranormal kind of community. It was like all these stories about this guy in a flannel shirt, and a flannel shirt is just a checkered shirt, right?
Right.
Talk to me a little bit more about that. Where have you seen that narrative over and over again? So we saw that narrative as it pertains to Mothman with those men being on the bridge. Have you seen that same narrative in anything else paranormal?
Yes. Well, John Keel kept finding a lot of times, we have the phenomena of the bedroom invader. And sometimes these entities or these men or whatever show up And sometimes they're wearing this checkered shirt. And I thought, I would read the reports from John Keel, and I thought, well, that's interesting. And but I hadn't heard it too many other places. And then one time, a few years ago, my wife and I were down in Tennessee visiting her uncle, and a lady friend of his was over. And as people do, start talking about the unexplained and ghosts and so forth. Now, this lady knows nothing about the literature, and she was talking about how she saw this man appear at the foot of her bed. And then she paused and she said, it's really weird. He was wearing a checkered shirt. And I thought, what? Here's somebody reporting this phenomenon that knows nothing about the literature. And I don't know what to make of it, except that perhaps if these entities or whatever represent good or evil, depending on the experiencer, perhaps the checkered shirt, if it's dark and light, perhaps it's something in between. It's something that manifests in different ways. That's way out there, but I don't know what to make of the. It also kind of ties in with what Keel called the grinning man. Uh, Sometimes a man in the checkered shirt has a kind of a silly grin on his face, and it's not necessarily a bedroom invader. A couple of young kids, trying to remember where, I think somewhere in Pennsylvania, they saw this very tall man in a silver suit. He was on the other side of a fence where he shouldn't really have had access to, and he was this grinning man. He was kind of oversized and so forth. So there's these strange motifs that keep showing up in some of these experiences.
Yeah, and that grinning man goes back for a very long time. It goes back. There were stories about a grinning man in Roman days. Roman soldiers were talking about seeing the grinning man. So I don't know what that is. I just wanted to, for the knowledge sake, I wanted to know if that checkered shirt man or flannel shirt man was something that had repeated itself. So I'll know for later.
Well,
Um,
even Indrid Cold, who was kind of connected with all this stuff, a supposed entity that Woodrow Derenberger, an appliance salesman, encountered on Route 77 north of Point Pleasant one night. He's also supposed to kind of fit the grinning man perspective.
Wow. Wow, that's cool. I'm glad. See, that's why I love doing these interviews. I love learning, man. This is how you become the most proficient person in the paranormal field is you got to talk to people who know more than you. All right, so now we went through the prophecies. We kind of and that was the first time I ever heard that he may or may not have landed on the bridge. All right, so talk to me about any investigations you've done. Have you been out in the woods looking for a Mothman yourself? Have you went looking?
Well, I've spent many nights and many days in the TNT area. John Keel was believed that certain people were kind of naturally tuned in to this phenomena. I apparently am not. I've had one bizarre experience in my entire life, but so I guess I have low expectations of actually seeing something. I've even been out in the TNT area alone at night, which is no big deal really. I mean, the locals go out there and do it all the time, but so I haven't really seen anything. Um, but other people other people do see shadow people and so forth in the TNT. But but this brings up a good point. John Keel, he had this great catchphrase. It was, ask the experiencer what they had for breakfast. Now what he meant was not literally whether or not they had post toasties, but find out, somebody that has he found that people that had a UFO encounter or a cryptid encounter, that they likely were the kind of person that was tuned into these things, and they likely had experiences all their life. And he would ask these kinds of questions, uh, and he would often find out that these people were since childhood were having experiences, whether they be abduction experiences or seeing strange lights in the sky. Let me give you an example. A lady from New Hampshire contacted me a few years ago, and uh, she and her husband were out on the front porch early in the morning having a cigarette. It was still dark. They're near an airport near Londonderry, and they're very familiar with the lights that go over. But then they saw these really strange lights coming toward them, and then all of a sudden, they're not standing next to each other. They're separated on the porch. It's a little bit lighter out, They look up and they see a giant black triangle brushing the tops of the trees on their property, and it takes off and moves away. And at that time, as happens with people that have these experiences sometimes, they said, "Oh," and then they went back to bed. It didn't strike them at the time how bizarre it was. They woke up later, and then she thought, "Boy, was that weird that we didn't react to this. Oh, and by the way, it looks like we were missing a half an hour." So she was on a quest to try and recover those memories. Well, she contacted me before she had that success. And so I asked her a series of questions that John Keel would have asked. And to make a long story short, here's what I found out. Uh, in her house, they were experiencing typical haunting and poltergeist phenomena. Both her sons were seeing orb phenomena. The younger one was seeing these golden orbs dancing outside his window at night before he went to bed. The other older son one time was in the house, and this ball of light came into the room, circled him, and then went out. She had experienced shadow people. Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who we lost a few years ago, she discovered when she was investigating shadow people that a significant percentage of those experiencers were also experiencing classic alien abduction phenomena. And then I asked this young lady, I said, "This is going to sound weird, but I knew that people that had these experiences sometimes had also seen some kind of a cryptid." I said, "Have you ever seen anything like a Bigfoot or some kind of a animal you couldn't identify?" And she told me no. And then she stopped and she said, "Well, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law near the property, they both saw something. And this creature was seen twice near the property. They described it as something that looked like a black panther, but standing on two legs." Now, the point of this is that if I was kind of frozen in the 1960s and hadn't been introduced to John Keel, I would have never known to ask all these other questions.
Right.
Because I would have thought, "Oh, okay, it was just an ET that picked him up. I hope she recovers those memories," and I would have missed all the other stuff that was there. And that's something that's fairly common, is that experiencers are somehow tuned in, and they have. Keel used kind of a literary device. He called it the super spectrum.
Well, I'm trying to figure out, did Keel ever go into why he thought they all experienced this hodgepodge of encounters? Did he formulate a theory as to why that was?
Just he thought that they were, certain people are naturally psychic. That a certain percentage of the population are just naturally more tuned in, and we all know people that are more tuned in, or pick up thoughts or have experiences. Again, I'm not one of them, but I know of people that have, and so it was just he just thought it was something inherent, something natural within the person that could tune into this, call it the super spectrum or whatever.
No, I agree with you. There's something that's about the individuals, because I have a witness out of Florida. I talked to him, man. I just talked to him like 2 weeks ago, and he just called. He's like, "Hey, man, I'm calling to check up on you." He started sending me pictures where he was not even at home. He was by his auntie's house because he had some legal trouble. He had to leave his house, then leave his mom's house, and go by his auntie house. He was like, "I'm still seeing these things," and he just snapped pictures of the woods by his auntie's house, and it's what looks like a 12-foot tall Bigfoot looking at him. Period. I mean, hands down, there's no way around it, and he does it consistently every month. He's sending me something different. So, and according to him, he can feel them looking at him, and he
Mhm.
knows where they are. So there's got to be some truth into that, into that theory of that people are psychic, or they have some kind of spiritual connection, or they have some kind of special um, eyesight that allows them to see this,
Yes.
even down the pictures. So yeah, man, that's crazy. That's insane. Tell me a little bit about this museum, because I'm thinking about maybe I need to come visit the museum. How long have you been there?
I've only actually been living here for a few weeks. Um, uh, and I, of course, but I've been involved with the Mothman Festival for several years. I'll tell you about that too. That's a blast. But yeah, you definitely got to check out the museum. It had humble beginnings in a smaller building across the street. Jeff Wamsley was about, again, 5 or 6 years old when the Mothman sighting started and when the bridge collapsed. And his one of his he was a paper boy, and one of his customers was Linda Scarberry. And so he's known a lot of these people all his life. And so he started collecting this material. I believe his dad was a National Guardsman at the time when all
Okay.
this was going down. And so he just kept accumulating stuff. He's written a couple of great books. They're oversized books. Mothman, The Facts Behind the Legend, and Mothman Behind the Red Eyes. And he's collected a lot of the articles and stuff in both those. But the really important thing he did, he went back and interviewed some of the original witnesses that were in the Mothman prophecies. He found other witnesses that were not originally in the book, and there was some, some inaccuracies that were written about before. He straightened some of those out, and they're just really invaluable. And he's he just put it together really well. There's also a merchandise section, where you can buy T-shirts and so forth, and it's just really high quality stuff. I mean, he's just done a phenomenal job. And what I'm doing is I'm there in there on weekends mostly, or during high volume, like if a bunch of school kids come in. Um, they the people behind the counter, they really don't have a lot of time to answer questions. Well, heck, I've been following this since November of '66, and so I'm the guy there to answer any questions, and I will introduce myself, and I'll ask people if this is the first time they've come to the museum and where they're from, and usually that'll get a conversation started. If if they want to be on their own, that's fine. I let them go. But I've gotten into some really just great conversations with people. It's just it's a job I enjoy going to work, because people, they tell me about their experiences. They have a lot of questions about that time period and so forth, and so it's just a lot of fun. But then every third weekend in September is the Mothman Festival, and that is a blast. Up and down Main Street, you have everything would normally have. You've got your your T-shirts, your food vendors. You got a zip line. You got bouncy houses. You got all that stuff. But then on the perpendicular road, uh, which where the Mothman statue is, right next to the museum, that's where the speakers usually have their tables and their books. And the speakers speak on Saturday and Sunday down the street in the State Theater about every topic you can imagine. But then Saturday night, this is the only thing that cost a couple of bucks. There's thousands of people that come to this. The only thing that cost $5 is the TNT Hayride tour. And I'm one of the tour guides. And Jeff Wamsley's another one. Brittany Sayer, who was a Miss Mothman a few years ago, she's another one. And her father also was in the National Guard at that time. So we take people into the TNT area. We form at the Farm Museum. Jeff has the actual a proper hayride. I mean, he's got the tractors pulling a cart with bales of hay on it. I have one of the old man carts with nice comfortable seats,
Wow.
so that's the one you want. And so we go into the TNT area, and it's the TNT area is creepy in the daytime, really creepy at night. It's a little bit like a Halloween hayride. You're approached by the men in black. They try and turn you around, but fortunately, they're much more like the Keystone Cops than the men in black. And there's a guaranteed flyover of the Mothman. My two buddies, they hide in the old Aspen plant behind the foliage, and this guy comes down the wire. His eyes are all lit up, and I think they borrowed a sound effect. Don't tell anybody, from an old Pink Floyd LP. So I think they owe back royalties too. But it is just a lot of fun, and people really have a good time. So that's a great way to experience Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the mysteries of the Mothman.
No, that sounds like a lot of fun, man. It really does. That's one of the things with a lot of the cryptid communities. It's so serious, man. It's so, rah, it's this, it's alive, it's flesh and blood, it's an alien, it's a demon. There is no leeway for anybody to really enjoy themselves and just, enjoy the concept of something like that existing. I'm definitely gonna come up there and take a look at it and check it out. It's a bit of a ride from New Orleans, Louisiana, but a couple of cigars, well, probably a half a box of cigars, I can get there with no problem.
Well, let me tell you, one Saturday I was in there. There was a gentleman that came in from Mexico a family from Puerto Rico, and two men from England. So people from all over the world show up. And sometimes when I'm doing the hayride, I'll ask people, trying to find out who traveled the furthest. Well, one time, one gentleman with a brogue spoke up and said Belfast, so he won that round.
Wow. And he's traveled specifically to come to the museum.
Well, a lot of times these people have. This has been a destination for them for a long time because they've seen it over the years on the documentaries that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, man. That's pretty awesome. The next question I wanted to run by you. Talk to me about some of the encounters from witnesses that you've heard about Mothman, like some recent encounters, some things that people reached out to you and told you about.
Well, there's not too much in the way of recent encounters. Let me check a note here. I'm trying to remember. The guy's name was Darren. This goes back to the Darren Hayes, I think it was. Jeff Wamsley interviewed him in one of his books, and that's about the 90s, mid 90s, I think. So there have been a couple sightings that now I have not talked to any of the more recent experiencers. I talked to Linda Scarberry, who was out there that first night, uh, Robin Bellamy, who was a girl of about 10 years old when all this was going on. And they were driving along the Ohio River, and she saw this thing standing in broad daylight right by the river. And another interesting character was Tom Urey. Now, he's mentioned in the Mothman prophecies, but his sighting is incorrect because he actually did not see the Mothman per se. He saw like a thunderbird, a giant bird with about a 10 to 12-foot wingspan. And he's vehement about what he saw. And he said it wasn't an osprey or whatever. He said, I'll take a lie detector on this. Unfortunately, we lost Tom a couple years ago. But that's a tragedy. Is so many of these good people are gone now. But he originally he told me. Well, let me tell you this other story first. He when Mary Heyer, the reporter, reported his story, I think in the story, she implied that it came from the TNT area. I think that was a mistake, and Tom didn't want it associated with the Mothman per se. And he knew Mary; they were friends, and so he jokingly came into her office one day and said, "Mary, I ought to kill you," and she said, "Don't worry, Tom. This will all blow over in about 2 weeks."
And it
Well, he
never
was
blew
telling me
over.
that story 40 years later.
Yeah, it never blew over.
Now here's the other thing. That this thing did freak him out, by the way, when he saw it. But when he saw this thing, he thought the other witnesses saw what he saw, but they freaked out and maybe added and I embellished it. Maybe it just that not intentionally, but it just freaked them out to the point where they added attributes to it. And I was talking to him this one year at the Mothman Festival. Jeff Wamsley would have some of these witnesses come in. He's sitting there with Linda Scarberry and another witness, Faye DeWitt, who was not mentioned in the book, The Mothman Prophecies. And it was the first time he met them. Well, he told me that a few years before, when they made the film, The Mothman Prophecies, which is almost 20 years ago now, with Richard Gere, they filmed it in Katanning, Pennsylvania, to double as Point Pleasant. Well, he was driving down there with another one of the major witnesses, Marcela Bennett, and uh, they were doing some kind of promotional thing. And he said, "Okay, let's swap stories." So he heard her story, and then he heard the other stories later on, and he finally decided. He said, "We saw something different." He did see a giant bird, but what they saw was nothing like a giant bird. And so, but in these high strangeness areas, all kinds of bizarre stuff are going on at the same time, it seems. So, I don't know why that is, but it's just very interesting. Marcella Bennett, by the way, she was the one that it was a classic case where she and her brother went out to visit some friends in the TNT area. There used to be people that lived out in that area, and they were just going to tap on the windows and maybe try to scare a couple of people because the stuff in the newspaper has been talking about the Mothman, and they didn't believe it. Well, they were going back to their car because they didn't get a response, and this thing rose up off the ground. She was carrying her infant child. She dropped her baby. Turns
Whoa.
out she was all right, but she was just absolutely stunned. So she gathered up her baby, and they got inside the house. And apparently this thing, whatever it was walking back and forth across the porch. Now, I never met Marcela Bennett, but I did see several long form interviews with her. She was one of the original witnesses, but I've not really talked to any of the and when we talk about more recent witnesses, we might be talking in the last 10 or 20 years. So whatever was going on in Point Pleasant seems to have at least dissipated to a good extent.
So, in just your personal opinion, and I mean, most people are scared to get into their personal opinions. What do you think this is, or build a case for what it could be? You know what I'm saying? Because to me, that sounds like it's definitely physical, a physical flesh and blood being that people have seen. However, why hasn't been seen recently is just insane to me. I mean, is it some kind of alien that came through a portal? What, I don't know. And so, what do you think it actually is?
But when I give talks, I was at the Beast of Bray Road conference a couple months ago. I have three basic premises when I start out. One is that there's likely more than one explanation for some of these things. You mentioned how people in the community kind of fight each other and kind of dig their heels in. It's this, no, it's that. There's some real divisions there. The second premise is we have to listen to the experiencer and try to rule out our preconceived ideas. Of course, we're always trying to validate the experiencer, because sometimes people will see something mundane and misinterpret it. And
Right.
sometimes some people are a little bit maybe off the rails a little bit. I mean, that happens. But if we do, now the third premise is that when we listen to the experiencer and we collect these things, we'll begin to find patterns that exist. So if the second premise, if you listen to what people reported, John Keel collected a little over 100 reports in that first year between 66 and 67. It was a paradox. People saw something that appeared physical. Keel even found footprints, some skinny little footprints near the old North Power Plant that may have been associated with this thing. But when it took off, it was about 6, 7 feet tall. It had about a 10-foot wingspan. A biologist might say 10 feet isn't big enough to carry a man-sized thing up in the air, but it didn't always flap its wings. It would put its wings behind it and sometimes take off straight like a helicopter. Birds of any size don't do that. They got to flap their wings, they got to get going and get the speed up and then take off. Again, the eyes seem to be self-generating light, at least not all the time, but sometimes. So, you have this thing that in some respects seems flesh and blood, other respects possibly is an apparition, perhaps paraphysical. But then to throw another wrench in it, Keel got a couple reports of people that saw it close by where it sounded kind of like it had an I don't know, a humming or something mechanical. One of the last witnesses, a woman named Mrs. Thomas, and she's one of these people that were having these prophetic dreams about packages floating in the river, just like Mary Hyre did. But she saw this creature in the TNT area toward the end of that year. It wasn't flying; it was walking extremely quickly or running like a robot, she said. So when you put all these different descriptions together, I don't know what the heck we're dealing with. It was a paradox. People were reporting something, unless there was more than one of these things, whatever they were. Perhaps that's the case. I don't know. But I really, even John Keel would have told you. John Keel used the term ultra terrestrial because he thought a lot of these things that we were dealing with weren't from off planet. They were a natural condition of the planet that we just didn't understand. He borrowed the term ultra terrestrial from Ivan Sanderson, he said. Of course, Ivan Sanderson was a friend and colleague. He was the great British naturalist that is probably best known for the Abominable Snowman legend come to life,
Okay.
and wrote a lot of great books on UFOs and so forth. But it was just the term. He actually would use it interchangeably sometimes, Keel, with elemental. And implying that whatever this was, it perhaps was extra dimensional. It was sort of here living alongside us, but invisible most of the time. Um, it's very difficult to try and put our finger on what it was. And again, Keel would tell you, I don't know what the Mothman was. And he was pretty convinced that he wrote a great book that really changed my viewpoint called Operation Trojan Horse. And that's when he wrote it in 1970. It came out before the Mothman Prophecies. Prophecies was, I'll tell you, I'll mention that in a minute. But Trojan Horse is where he begins to demonstrate the interconnectedness of all paranormal phenomena: UFOs, lights in the sky, cryptids, uh, uh, psychic phenomena. In fact, a lot of people that experienced the Mothman, and there was a Swedish researcher named Franzen that had corresponded with Keel, and Keel gave him a letter to present to people in Point Pleasant. He showed up about 1971 and re-interviewed many of the witnesses and found others. And they found that a lot of the people that saw the Mothman would go home and have an outbreak of poltergeist phenomena. Now, how the heck? What does that tell us about this
Yeah, that's
entity?
wow, dude. That's on a scale of yeah, that's just crazy and wow. Circle back to something for me really quickly. I don't know if I missed this in the conversation. I listened very attentively, but you talked about someone dreaming about packages in the
Yes.
river. What's that
Okay.
about?
That has to do with the Mothman prophecies. There were a lot of prophecies that Keel was receiving from individuals that firmly believed they were in contact with some other intelligence. Some of this was through channeling. Some of this were claims of they're actually talking to the Space Brothers, so to speak. But Mary Hyre, who was very sensitive, uh, she kept telling John Keel about this foreboding, uh, about something going to happen. And she was dreaming about Christmas packages floating on the river. So did Mrs. Thomas. And many of these people that now John Keel called them silent contactees, because these people had no doubt that they were in contact with these uh, entities, whatever they thought they were, Space Brothers or whatever. And but they didn't care. They didn't want any publicity. They were given some kind of a quest to perform, and they would get these prophecies, and sometimes the prophecies would come true, and then sometimes they'd get the big prophecy, where they say there was one guy, I guess, several things had come true, and then he was told that, oh, world's going to end. Get everybody together on the hill. The Space Brothers will come and take you away, and they don't show up. Well, that's gotta ruin your day. But so yes, and then when the bridge actually collapsed, there's another story about that. Keel kept these prophecies from these several dozen contactees started to collate, and they talked about there's going to be something going to happen on December 15th, and then he was told it was going to be the great EM effect. They didn't say what the EM effect was going to be specifically, but there were going to be power outages and days of darkness and all this stuff. So Keel, but also they talked about something happening on the river, and Keel was convinced that it was going to be some kind of a plant, a chemical plant or something blowing up. But he was afraid to tell anybody because you tell somebody and then it blows up and then you go to jail. So, but he was convinced. He got very paranoid, and he was in New York City at the time. Well, December 15th rolls around when this EM effect is going to happen, and it's supposed to happen the moment that President Johnson lights the Christmas tree lights at Rockefeller Center.
Okay.
The lights go on, nothing happens, and then there's a news blurb that comes over the TV that the bridge between Point Pleasant and Ohio has collapsed. So it's almost like, unless it was a coincidence, it's almost like an intentional deception. If that was supposed to be a harbinger, it gave the wrong information. They're, nobody's looking at the bridge; they're looking elsewhere. Yet something terrible happened, And so it was all the Christmas packages were was and what came true because this was December 15th, 1967. It's just after 5 o'clock. The sun's almost down. It's 20 degrees outside. The bridge is filled with rush hour traffic and Christmas traffic. 46 people lost their lives that night. I even, a few years ago, I talked to a survivor that was on the bridge,
Whoa.
Bill Edmondson. He a few years ago, well, it was 2017 was the 50-year remembrance ceremony they had down in Point Pleasant. And if you go down there at 6th Street in Point Pleasant is where the bridge used to go over to the Ohio. And on the flood wall now, they have this beautiful mural of the way the bridge looked, the perspective and everything, the way it looked going over to the Ohio side. Also, they've got a memorial there. And on the sidewalk, they have the names of the 46 people that died. Well, Bill Edmondson, I met him at the River Museum down the street the next day. He was 88 years old, which means he was 38 when he was crossing the bridge in a semi with material to go to a tire plant in Detroit. And I don't know if you've seen the film, The Mothman Prophecies.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Well, remember at the end, people remember at the end, Richard Gere realizes somehow the bridge is going to collapse. And so he has all kinds of time running around and warning people. In truth, the bridge took 30 to 40 seconds to collapse. And the span, if you can imagine the span straight out in front of you, Bill Edmondson told us that it just started swaying back and forth. And it went so far to the right, he had to hold on to the steering wheel in his truck to stay put. Everything broke loose. And the truck, and he hit the water. He was forced through the passenger passenger window, right arm first. He showed us he still couldn't straighten out his arm because he had a pin in it, but he went through that window, and it a little bit comical. Sometimes gentlemen will loosen their breeches a bit to be comfortable driving. Well,
Right.
he had done that, but when he hit the water, his pants were dragging behind him. They didn't come off because of the 1960s pant cuffs. So when it was dragging behind him, he actually got out of the truck. He went to the bottom. The current started bringing him up, but then debris or something, caught his pants that
And
were
start
dragging
pulling them
behind
back
him
down.
and started to pull him back down. He fortunately shook loose somehow. He came to the surface. Imagine his right arm is shattered. Imagine how cold that water is. And he hit the surface. Some of the material he had been hauling had a slit in it. He put his left arm through to stay buoyant. A tugboat captain saw him and pulled him up out of the water moments before he would have died of hypothermia. And that just blew me away. I've never heard a one-on-one story about survival like that, although I've seen dozens of them on TV. But that was and he had come up from North Carolina to pay his respects to those that had died on the bridge that night.
Let me ask you this question. So, in that area, around the bridge, in that area, just in general, has there been any known cases of people who use black magic? Because like that sounds like to me those number of people dying sounds like some kind of ritual sacrifice. Has there been any evidence of that? It's like real hardcore magic practitioners.
No, but
Okay.
in the TNT area, there has been a lot of evidence that people have gone out there with, drawing circles in the ground. And, people say they see shadow people out there. And I don't know if there is some kind of an entity inherent to that area, or if some of these things are perhaps conjured up out of the super spectrum or the collective unconscious. Who knows? But I was out in the TNT area one night with a couple ladies, and they were both picking up on something like shadow people. And we talked to them separately, and they were both kind of sensing the same thing. It was very interesting. But I've not. I don't
But
experience
you've heard
anything.
nothing like historically, nothing like not recent time,
No.
but back in the day, you haven't heard anything. Okay, all right,
Well, no.
that, that
There was the belief in the Chief Cornstalk curse. Chief Cornstalk was a Shawnee chief that was murdered around the time of the Revolution. all the big battles took place of the Revolution. The first ones took place around Point Pleasant, and if you go just a little bit south of on the south end of Point Pleasant, where the two rivers come together, the Kanawha and the Ohio, Towinde Park, that's where Chief Cornstalk is buried. He was a peacemaker, and he was betrayed and murdered. Now, some people claimed that he uttered a curse, put a 200-year-old curse on the area as he died. It's probably nonsense. Look, these areas show up all over the globe, and it's not because of curses, I don't believe. But they found a Denny Bellamy, who is one of the one of the heads of the town of Point Pleasant. They were tearing down an old school, and in the wall, they found an old play from 1920s, dramatizing Chief Cornstalk, and they think that the curse stuff came from a dramatization of the Cornstalk legend, and it probably has no substance whatsoever. If anybody had a right to curse anybody the way he was betrayed, he certainly did, but it probably didn't happen.
Wow. All right, Steve, we're right at the 10-minute mark before we hit that hour. I want to give you an opportunity to tell everybody where they can find you. I want to make sure before you do that, I tell you, I want to have you back on because I really enjoy talking to you about Mothman, and this is one of the topics that I want to know more about. So I'm going to have you back on rather quickly here. But tell everybody where they can find you.
Well, I'm on Facebook, Steve Ward. It used to be, I was up in Michigan, and if you typed in Battle Creek, you could find me. Now I think if you type in Point Pleasant, you'll find the right Steve Ward. Come and see me at the Mothman Museum on weekends. I do a podcast on the Paranormal UK radio network called The High Strangeness Factor. I have been on hiatus because I was in the process of selling a house and buying a house. And anybody that has done that knows how chaotic that can be. You should see the state of the house here. I've got books all over the place, but none of them are where they belong. I'm also weekly on Mac Maloney's Military X Files as a correspondent, and that's a lot of fun. You can find that on the same network and other platforms. I'm currently allegedly writing a book, which I expect to be out sometime this decade, and the it's untitled, but the idea is my fascination is with the patterns, the connections, the parallels that take place. Maybe next time I come on, we can talk about some of the just bizarre things like vehicle stoppages, right? Well, UFOs sometimes that come close to vehicles seem to stop the car. But what about a phantom army doing the same thing? What about the close proximity of a Bigfoot? It's just crazy, some of the patterns that show up, which are just fascinating. And that's what my book will be about, those kinds of connections.
All right. Well, it sounds good. I'm definitely going to have you back. I'm going to reach out to Wes as soon as we get off. Have him try and schedule for like another week or two out, and have you come right back because I do want to get into the
Be my
patterns.
pleasure.
This is what people don't understand. When you start taking eyewitness data, patterns start to form, and it's
Yes.
impossible. The probability of these patterns starting to form numerically is just impossible. That's how you can identify something weird is really going on. People talk about, oh, this is weird and this is strange. No, when you start looking at the data and you say, wait, this happened way over here, and then this happened in Canada, and this happened in South America, that's not probable. It just doesn't
And,
work that
and,
way.
and sometimes it's a decade or two apart.
Yep.
It's really, I think by studying that aspect, we might actually make some headway to trying to understand what's going on.
All right, brother Steve, I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on. I'm going to make sure I post a link to all of your locations, your Facebook and YouTube and everything in the description. And I'll have you back soon. I appreciate you spending some time with us.
Thank you very much. I really had a good time. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, bye bye.
Bye.